the next talk, Nick Downs from Geoscience Operations Group of the Nevada National Security Site. Thank you, Nick.
Hey there, everybody. I'm Nick Downs, geologist at the Nevada National Security Site. I'm really honored and happy to be here with y'all. Before I joined the Nevada Test Site, which is what how most of us refer to the NNSS, I worked for oil and gas industry for about a decade as a geologist. So suffice it to say, Armageddon is my favorite movie. If you guys don't recall, that's the one where the oil drillers fly the space shuttle to the asteroid and blow it up with nukes and save the planet. Yeah, it's like Dart before Dart, you know, but not a very realistic plot point, suffice it to say. No, but jokes aside, happy to be here. The theme of my talk today is what's in a test site, and Paul made some really great and salient points earlier about some of the existing test beds out there. And so I took a stab on the next slide, Andrea, about from a geologist perspective, what goes into an effective lunar proving ground or lunar analog test bed. And of course, geology's got to be at the top. It's got to be geologically analogous, basaltic, or feldspathic if you're returning to the highlands. Ideally, you'd have a freshly cratered terrain as well. And freshly cratered for a geologist means different things than for most other people. But you know, less than 10,000 years old on Earth weathering would be pretty young, in my opinion. Ideally, you'd also have some permanently shadowed regions, some PSRs present on your test bed, although they may be seasonal PSRs, which I know is a bit of a contradiction there. Secondly, I think your test bed should be of the appropriate scale. This is where Paul made some really thoughtful comments about this. Some of our testing is perfectly appropriate to be done in a sandbox, and then other testing needs to be done at kilometer scale. Thirdly and fourthly, it needs to be in a convenient location, one that you can access, and one that has some, at least minimum amount of facility and infrastructure present. So you don't have to take water with you when you go and test your rovers out. Fifthly, I'd propose it needs to be private and secure, especially with respect to commercial companies. You may have proprietary techniques or proprietary hardware that you don't want your competitor companies peering over the fence at. Similarly, Meteor Crater, although it's a beautiful analog there, the second picture from the right, gets over 250,000 visitors a year. And so this is definitely a challenge when you're operating on public land. I'd also propose that an ideal lunar proving ground would be modifiable. So vegetation, if it's present, like will be the case for most active lunar proving grounds. If you can devegetate, that's great. It'd also be great if you could build new craters, such as what the USGS and NASA did during the Apollo era north of Flagstaff. Number 7 is my personal favorite, the wild card factor. I think we all have to recognize that any lunar proving ground that we're going to utilize, small scale or large scale, is going to fall short of what we're actually going to be experiencing on the moon. And so this is kind of a question, not an answer, but how do we capture those otherworldly vibes that the astronauts are going to encounter? And lastly, it has to be affordable. Again, hearkening back to the commercial comment, if you've got commercial companies utilizing your test beds, they have to be able to afford it. And last time I checked, I don't think Artemis is measuring its budget in percentages of GDP like we were with Apollo. So also highly relevant. So I can't speak to all of the relevant test beds out there, of which there's several dozen, but I can speak to the Nevada National Security Site, which is my employer. So Andrea, next slide. So the NNSS, or the test site as we refer to it, is the nation's premier indoor, outdoor, and underground testing facility. We're about 60 miles north of Las Vegas, which is where I live, and we're about the size of Rhode Island. In fact, we're a little bit larger than Rhode Island. So it's a large playground in which many different customers come out and do high hazard experimentation. Now, our legacy customers have been almost exclusively Department of Defense related, although as you'll see, NASA was one of our legacy customers as well. But we support a very wide range of programs. It's also worthwhile to mention, I believe, that we've got significant existing infrastructure above ground and existing below ground infrastructure in the form of tunnels and underground complexes. And above ground, we're actually FAA exempt. So if you're interested in flying prototypes or other interesting things, this is a good place to do it. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the past here of the NNSS. It was formed in 1950, and the test site was the primary testing ground for our country's atomic weapons. We tested 100 nukes in above ground atmospheric tests. And then when that was banned in the early 1960s, testing moved underground. There were 828 underground tests at the test site. And don't worry, they're wearing sunglasses for protection there on the right. Those bleachers are still there. I don't know where the people are though. Yeah. Yeah, wear your sunscreen, that's right. So suffice it to say, there's a complex cultural and environmental legacy here, right? I think everybody can recognize that. Fortunately for us, though, one of the other legacies of the underground testing is that when you set off 828 nukes underground, you end up with a large number of large craters. I would propose this is probably the most cratered place on Earth, but maybe somebody can prove me wrong on that. Next slide. Okay, good. The video worked. Yeah, let's hit play on that. So that little video you're seeing there is one of these underground tests. This was the Sedan test. This was part of the Plowshare program, which, if you're not familiar, was our attempt to use atoms for peace. That was the term of the day. So if you wanted to build a second Panama Canal, why not? Or if you wanted to build a harbor somewhere, how would you do that? Are nuclear weapons a viable way to do that? That's what this program was designed to test, and it ran for about 15 years. The Sedan test is noteworthy. On the next slide, you'll see just how large that test was. It was equivalent to 100,000 tons of TNT. So that's a lot of bulldozers. Apologies to Caterpillar. And it was buried about 600 feet deep in alluvium. And so the crater there is about 1,200 feet wide. That's actually some of the Apollo astronauts on the picture on the right, peering over the edge. And if you've got a project that brings you out to the test site, we'll take you to that same spot and you can look over the edge as well. I think it's also worth noting that there's several dozen smaller craters surrounding the Sedan test bed. And so that's why this is a focus area in our discussions with the Artemis team to train astronauts at this locale. Let's look at the next slide. One of our other test beds, really, in my opinion, the most spectacular test bed at the site is called the Schooner crater. This was a smaller shot, 30 kilotons, 30,000 tons equivalent of TNT. It was more shallow, and the crater's about 800 feet wide. So you'd be able to fit a football field in the crater there at left. And with the video there, I know it's difficult to get an appreciation for the scale of the ejecta there, but those blocks that are spalling off there, those are about the size of a school bus. We'll see a few more pictures that speaks to that. So really spectacular ejecta field. It's my favorite spot. Let's go to the next one. Okay, and the third test bed I'd like to share with you guys is called Buckboard Mesa. So Sedan, the very first one, was in alluvium. That's basically dirt for the non-geologist. Schooner was in welded volcanic tuff. That's welded ash, essentially, from volcanoes. And Buckboard Mesa is a basaltic mesa. And so this was the site of about a dozen different tests, 2 of which were nuclear, 10 of which were high explosive. And the map that you're seeing there on the right is one of the long Apollo traverses that the Apollo team came out and tested, not just for training purposes, but also tested some equipment out here as well. And so this is a third very interesting site for us. That's one of the craters on the left with a few Apollo folks and a few of our geologists standing on the rim of one of these high explosive craters. So pretty spectacular as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, and here are a few archival photos that we were able to dredge up. So this was Apollo 16 training mission. There they are descending the lunar module there that's on the back of a Dodge truck. I think that's the other point I wanted to make is that, everybody's got to, play a little bit of pretend with these lunar proving grounds. And I don't think there's any shame in that. What's important is that we recognize where we're compromising with these different lunar grounds, lunar testing grounds. So next picture. Okay, and here they are. This is Apollo 17. The guys looking very dapper in their aviators, bouncing around the ejecta field in their lunar rover. I believe that lunar rover is currently in Flagstaff at the USGS Center there. Next slide. Okay, so this is the Schooner ejecta field, and those are some of the large boulders that were blown out of the crater. There's I would say not very much scientific work, to be perfectly frank, that's been done at some of these craters. As a geologist, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, especially if we're going to use it as a future testing ground for lunar or Martian missions. But nevertheless, the Apollo guys did their best. There are a couple of interesting papers out there that speak to some of the geology and the testing out here at the test site. I'd encourage you to look those up if you're interested. I'm happy to share them too. And on the last slide here, there they are, practicing some field geology in cowboy hats too. So one more slide, I think, is my final slide here. So internally, we call this Project Moonshot. What we're trying to do on our small geology team is revamp these 3 different test beds. As I mentioned, we're working with the Artemis team out of Johnson to come out and prepare for a 2023 training mission for Artemis astronauts to come out and use our 3 different test beds. So if you're part of a company or part of another organization that has got testing that you would like to do, and these test beds might be appropriate, please do reach out. My contact is on the next slide. Feel free to give me a call or send me an email. We'd love to talk. And I'll take any questions on the panel.